Hello, I'm Catherine Harmer from the University of Oxford in the UK, and I'm a Professor of Cognitive Neuroscience there. I'm going to be talking about hot and cold cognitive impairment in depression, how this is represented in the brain, and how current intervention strategies affect these key underlying mechanisms. So we know that depression affects aspects of so-called hot and cold cognition. Now, cold cognition is the very building blocks of cognition. It's how we learn things, how we remember things, how we plan and make decisions. Now, hot cognition, by contrast, is when we look at the influence of emotion on these same underlying processes. So how emotional things affect what we remember, how we plan and make decisions. And we know that both these aspects of cognition are affected in depression. And so these are the different terms that commonly fall under these different definitions. So under hot cognition, we have things like negative attention bias, where patients' attention is more likely to get drawn to negative things in their environment. We have over-response to negative feedback, which is once people start to make errors in a task, they can be more sensitive to that and go on and make further errors following that feedback. And we also have an increased perception and memory for negative over more positive, effective information. So people with depression are more likely to see things as negative in nature and to remember these negative things later. Under cold cognition, we have things like attention, so the ability to sustain and focus attention, executive function, which includes the ability to plan, to make decisions, to weigh up different lines of evidence, to regulate your behaviour, and some forms of memory as well, such as episodic memory for things that have happened. Now, these types of cognition are not strictly separated. We know that they can affect each other. So this over-response to negative feedback, which falls under hot cognition, can actually affect how people are performing in these more cold cognitive tasks. And we also know that the neural underpinnings of these different aspects of cognition are not completely separate. And so, for example, areas of the brain like the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex seem to be very important, both for executive function, but also equally for regulating and inhibiting our response when emotional things are around. And so I'm going to start by focusing on cold cognition in depression. What aspects of cognition are affected here? And so what we see in depression is very broad, generalised impairments across different tested domains. And so this is the result of a meta-analysis looking at performance of patients with depression compared to healthy controls, all using one particular neuropsychological assessment, the Cambridge CANTAB test. And you can see here a number of different tests have been applied across these different studies, coming under the different dimensions of executive function, memory and attention. And on the y-axis you can see the effect size of the impairment compared to healthy controls. And you can see that there's no one cognitive domain that really stands out as being affected over any of the others. You see a very non-specific difficulty in patients with depression when they do any one of these kinds of tasks. And this is a very consistent and highly replicated observation that in depression, these kinds of impairments will critically affect how people are able to do these kinds of cognitive operations. We can also see that these kinds of cognitive impairments are correlated with the overall severity of depression. And so this again is the result of a meta-analysis looking this time at the relationship between the other symptoms of depression and this kind of cognitive impairment. And you can see the names of each study and then the summary statistic for each cognitive domain. And you can see that there's robust evidence that cognitive impairment gets worse as depression severity gets worse for executive function, for episodic memory, and also for processing speed, and less so for semantic memory and visuospatial function. So this suggests that these kinds of cognitive impairments are very core to the experience of depression, and they track these other symptoms of depression. So they're an integral part of the experience. we often think about these kinds of cognitive impairments as getting better when patients recover from an episode of depression. But more and more evidence suggests that this is in fact not true. And for many patients, these kinds of impairments in cognitive function continue to impact on their everyday function. This is a result of a large study conducted by Philippe Gorwood in France, and they looked at memory ability in patients in remission from depression. And you can see here this ability to remember words from a list as a function of the number of depressive episodes that the patient had experienced. And so under 0 episodes, these are the healthy controls, and you can see that the more episodes of depression you've had in the past, the worse your cognitive function tends to be, even during periods of remission from the disorder. So once you've had 3 episodes of depression in the past, these kinds of impairments tend to be relatively long-lasting and therefore can continue to impact on the life and function of patients with this disorder, even when the other symptoms of the disorder have largely resolved. So these effects on cold cognition are highly consistent, they're very broad, and they don't always get better as the patient remits. What happens when we throw emotion into the mix, when we look at the influence of emotion on these core aspects of cognition? And going back to the work of Aaron Beck in the 60s and 70s, there was this theory that in depression they show an over-prioritization of negative compared to positive emotional information. And so we're all surrounded by multiple cues and pieces of information at any one time, far too much for us to take in. And so we all have this way of selecting things that are particularly relevant to ourselves to focus on and to explore further. And the idea is that in depression, this algorithm is set in a more negative style, so they're more likely to selectively pull up the negative things in the environment. And so, for example, if I showed a depressed patient these 2 different facial expressions here on the screen, they'd be more likely to be drawn to the negative facial expression, this threat-relevant facial expression. They'd be more likely to see this as negative in the first place, and they'd also be more likely to remember this later. And actually people without depression and without prior history of depression tend to get drawn more to the positive affective stimuli, to this positive smiling facial expression, which is very important for social reward and reinforcement and approach behaviour in social situations. And we can measure these kinds of negative biases in a number of ways. We can ask the patients about them in clinical interviews, we can perform questionnaire measures, we can also look at objective measures on computerised tests, which can be measured in the clinic or in the lab. And there are different tests tapping into these different aspects of cognitive function. And so a common test, for example, to measure negative affective bias is the dot probe paradigm. And you can see an example of this paradigm in the slide. And you can see that there's 2 faces presented on the computer screen. And the premise behind this task is that if your attention gets drawn to the more negative facial expression of the pair here, and then you present the probe, the dot, to which the participant has to respond as fast as possible in the same position, they'll be relatively faster to respond. And so you can track the reaction time benefit of putting the probe in the position where you think the patient's attention may be drawn. And so through a combination of these different trials and different presentations, you can calculate a vigilance score, which is the benefit to speed of having the dot in the same place as the emotional face. And you can see here some results from a test carried out in 3 separate groups of participants. So you have the bias score. A higher score means more attention to that emotional facial expression. And in the healthy controls, you can see that there's much more attention to the happy face. This is the one that's grabbing attention and people are orienting to. And there actually seems to be a little bit of avoidance to the negative, sad face. But in the group with depression, this effect is reversed, and it's the sad faces that seem to be more captivating to the patients with depression, and they're ignoring these more positive facial expressions of happiness. And an interesting observation about this study was that they included a group of patients in remission from depression who were no longer in an acute episode, and you can still see this exact same bias. They're more likely to be processing these sad negative cues than the positive ones. So it suggests that these kinds of biases don't necessarily get better when patients recover from depression, and therefore it's often thought that they may represent some kind of vulnerability marker, some likelihood of developing depression in the future. You can also measure the perception of these kinds of emotional cues. Again, this is commonly done with facial expressions of emotion. Here you may present different facial expressions, different intensities or different levels, and you ask people to indicate what they can see in a judgment test. And here are some data looking at the likelihood of seeing very ambiguous faces as sad versus happy. And you can see that when people are healthy, they're more likely to believe that a face is happy. If they're unsure, they're more likely to go with a positive interpretation. Whereas this same positive bias isn't there in the people who are depressed. They're equally likely to see these as sad or happy. And so it suggests they're actually seeing the same cues in a slightly different way to people who are not vulnerable to depression. They may not be able to report this or articulate it consciously, but you can pick up these more automatic styles of processing in these kinds of computerized tasks. And finally, we have emotional memory. So this looks at how memory is affected by whether the stimuli are positive or negative. And so in this task, we present very positive words or very negative words, words like mean or dishonest or original. And this is in the context of one task, and then sometime later we ask participants to try and remember as many of these words as possible. When people are healthy, they tend to remember more of the positive words in this task. These positive personality descriptors seem to be more salient or more important to the healthy controls. But this again is reversed in patients with depression. They're more likely to remember the negative over the positive words in this kind of task. And so it suggests that all of these different stages of cognitive processing are affected by emotion, that depressed patients are focusing more on negative things, they're perceiving these things as more negative, and they're picking up and remembering these negative interpretations more as well. So many investigators have been interested in the underlying neural correlates of these kinds of changes in hot cognition. And this is a very influential model which summarises a lot of the data to date. It was proposed by Mary Phillips and suggests that negative bias in depression comes about when there's an imbalance in corticolimbic responses. And so you can see these areas in red. These are parts of the brain that are very important for picking up and processing emotional cues. So they're kind of salience detectors, or things that are tuned for perhaps danger in the environment. And these areas tend to show an over-response to negative information in depression. At the same time, the areas in blue, these are parts of the circuit which are important for regulation, that might put a brake on some of these emotional responses or regulate these emotional responses. So this includes parts of the brain such as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And there's evidence in depression that these areas are not working as effectively as the healthy controls. So there's an overactivity in the red part and an underactivity in the blue part. And this is supported by a lot of empirical data. These are the results of a meta-analysis taking studies in fMRI scanners where patients and controls are presented with different types of emotional stimuli. And these are the areas which come out as different between the depressed group and the healthy controls. And so these areas outlined in red, such as the amygdala and the insula, tend to show an over-response in depression, particularly to negative affective stimuli. So this is very consistent with the model. These are parts of the brain that are involved in salience or vigilance or importance. And then the areas in blue seem to have underactivity in activation during emotional paradigms compared to healthy controls. And this is parts of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. So it's very consistent with the model that there's too much drive on the emotional centres of the brain and not enough regulation or control from the higher order circuits of the brain. And this is an example of one of the studies included in this meta-analysis, which also shows that this effect doesn't necessarily get better when patients are in remission from depression. So this was a study led by Teresa Victor, where they presented these facial expressions of sadness or happiness in an fMRI scanner in people with depression or healthy controls. And they identified this effect in the amygdala, part of this emotional vigilance circuit. And you can see that in the depressed patients in blue, they show an overactivity of this amygdala interest in the negative stimuli compared to the healthy controls. But actually the group in red, the remitted depressed patients, show exactly the same effect. So it suggests that these kinds of biases at the brain level in processing emotional information are also potentially part of this trait vulnerability process for depression. And there's also evidence that the underactivity of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex could precede the development of depression. This was a study that was conducted in young people who had an increased familial risk for depression. They had a parent who had developed MDD, but themselves, in the context of this study, at this time point, hadn't developed any symptoms of depression. And we presented these kinds of positive and negative emotional stimuli in the fMRI scanner. And we found that the young people who are increased risk of depression, even though they had no personal experience of depression, showed decreased engagement of this dorsolateral prefrontal cortex area, suggesting that this regulation strategy or regulation circuit may not be working even before the formal onset of depression. And so we can also ask how interventions for depression will affect these key aspects of hot cognition. And actually there's evidence that antidepressant drug treatments can affect these processes of emotional cognition in depression. And they actually do so surprisingly early, even after just a single dose of an antidepressant. So these were data that we collected looking at the effects of a single antidepressant compared to placebo in depressed patients, but not looking at the clinical outcome, which we knew wouldn't be affected after just one dose, but whether this could change emotional processing function. And so on the left, you can see the ability to recognise happy facial expressions of emotion in this kind of facial expression recognition task. And this is in the people receiving placebo. And so we can look at the influence of depression. And you can see that the depressed patients find it much harder to pick up on these positive facial expressions of emotion. And then on the right, you can see the effect of just one dose of an antidepressant on this emotional processing outcome. Even though the patients didn't feel clinically any better, their depression hadn't changed, there was an improvement in the ability to recognise these positive facial expressions of happiness. So it suggests that things can start to change even before people are aware of them at a clinical level. You can also see a similar effect in terms of emotional memory. Again, same format of the slide. On the left, you can see the ability to remember positive and negative items in the healthy and the depressed groups under placebo. And you can see that the depressed patients find it much harder to remember the positive items in this test. And then on the right, you can see the effect of the antidepressant treatment, just a single dose, but now memory for positive items has been restored. Now again, this occurs even though the patients are not feeling any better from their depression at this early time point, suggesting that this may be an early change, which potentially could be important in the way in which antidepressant treatments are working. In terms of the neural effects, we see a similar effect of normalization of these kinds of negative biases. And so we see a normalization of activity levels in parts of the brain important for salience, detection and response, such as the amygdala and the anterior cingulate, and also an upregulation of response in areas of the brain important for regulation, such as the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. And that's shown in this recent meta-analysis here, taking studies from both healthy people and depressed patients together across different durations of treatment. So this seems to be some kind of neural signature of taking antidepressant drug treatment. And like with the behavioural work that I just presented, these effects of antidepressants in terms of the neural response to emotional information are seen very early on with antidepressant drug treatment. And so in this study, we looked at the effect of giving depressed patients an SSRI or placebo every day for a 7-day period. And we looked at the effects in response to positive and negative facial expressions in the scanner. And you can see that the placebo group are still showing a very robust amygdala response to this negative facial expression, in this case of fear. But actually those who've received the SSRI for just 7 days, this response has completely reduced. Now clinically, these two groups of patients were indistinguishable. They had similar Hamilton Depression Rating Scale scores after this 1 week of treatment. It was too early to see a clinical effect, but you can see that these effects in the brain are already occurring, and they could well sow the seeds for later change. And so this could be a mechanism by which antidepressant drug treatments are working, essentially by reducing the influence of this maintaining factor in the treatment of depression. And so we tested this hypothesis in the next study by looking at the ability of these early changes in emotional processing to predict later clinical response. And so we gave an antidepressant, an SSRI, every day for 6 weeks to a sample of depressed patients. And this allowed us to divide up the patients into those who were responding or not by the end of treatment, based on at least a 50% drop in Hamilton Depression Rating Scale score. And we were interested in whether we could predict this clinical response by these early changes in the neural response in terms of fMRI. And so we measured fMRI response at baseline and after 1 week. We were able to see a very clear circuit which was associated with later clinical response. And this included parts of the brain that have come up time and time again in depression and in emotional processing function. So areas like the amygdala, the thalamus, the insula, the anterior cingulate. And you can see the direction of these effects in the graph. And it seems to be that only the people who are responding to the antidepressant after 6 weeks show this pattern of reduced response in the amygdala and in these other parts of the brain to negative versus positive affective information. So it seems that this early shift in positive versus negative function may be important for setting the scene for later clinically relevant changes in symptoms. So it may add to our understanding of how these drug treatments are working, that actually they are doing important things within the brain very, very quickly. These may not be consciously accessible by the patient or picked up by clinicians, but they seem to be related and predictive of what happens later. So we're often asked if these effects of drug treatments are also seen with other interventions for the treatment of depression. And there's growing evidence that different modalities for the treatment of depression also seem to affect these core aspects of function. So direct current stimulation of the brain, which has some efficacy in the treatment of depression, seems to produce similar effects. And other environmental manipulations also seem to impinge on these emotional processing functions. And we can also explore the influence of psychological interventions, the talking therapies, such as cognitive behavioural therapy. And there's growing evidence that this kind of psychological intervention also affects these kinds of key processes in the brain. So there are a number of studies that have looked at this neural response to emotional information before treatment and at the end. And they keep on highlighting these same kinds of underlying circuits, so changes in the amygdala, in the hippocampus, and in the anterior cingulate. This line of work is, though, still at a very early line of investigation, and most of these studies so far have been conducted without a comparator condition, and so it's difficult to really isolate at this time point if these are a causative effect on this neural circuitry which predicts clinical benefit, and that is the subject of ongoing investigation. So just to put all of this together, hot and cold impairments in cognition are commonly described in depression, and these seem to both continue to affect patients even after remission from depression, and therefore have the potential to keep on impacting function for many years to come. I've talked particularly about the neural basis of these effects and the effects of treatments in terms of their actions on hot cognition. We know that hot cognition involves imbalance in frontal limbic circuits. We also know that these can be targeted by different types of treatment for depression. And this seems to include both pharmacological and psychological interventions in the treatment of depression.